Welcome to the next lecture on utilitarianism. We are continuing our discussion of greatest good for the greatest number moral theory. This time we will be looking at John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill lived from 1806 to 1873, and he was a student to Jeremy Bentham and also a member of Parliament. He was very politically active. And what John Stuart Mill is most notably remembered for is this idea of really formulating utilitarianism and talking about how the greatest good or the greatest happiness principle, which is greatest good for the greatest number, really leads to a kind of moral position on liberty and how our actions should be evaluated. Now, one might think that just because we're trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, that we're going to somehow become this kind of Epicurean kind of hedonist, right? Just all we want to do is eat and drink and have sex. But Mill makes the distinction between different types of pleasures, and so is able to really avoid this criticism. And he makes this distinction by talking about two different types of pleasures, or two kinds of pleasures, right? The basic pleasures, which are going to be those eating, drinking, sex, things that occur in the animal world, and then distinguish that from the higher pleasures, which are those pleasures that are primarily human. And so when we think of these kind of basic pleasures, they're essentially the ones we share with the animal kingdom. These are visceral, these are instinctual. But these are lesser pleasures as compared to higher pleasures, right? These types of pleasures are more of just content. So that, right, when we have this fulfillment of these pleasures, there's a certain level of contentment. It's the higher pleasures for John Stuart Mill that have more intrinsic value, right? And it's these type of pleasures that really bring about actual happiness. And so it's these types of pleasures that we want to maximize, not necessarily just this hedonistic, visceral, animalistic drive, this pleasure, but actual happiness, art, music, travel, experience, these types of things that seem to be a bit different from the experiences that you get in just nature. And so Mill really invites us to think of these distinctions by getting us to imagine kind of a pleasurable life without the higher pleasures. A life of just kind of pure food, fun. If you were to imagine just constantly eating good food, having good sex, drinking good drink, partying constantly, while that does sound amazing, right? At some point, that would probably get extremely tiring. And so this is where Mill suggests, right, that type of lifestyle is actually going to be much less pleasurable than a type of lifestyle that includes the higher pleasures. The higher pleasure, the study of art, the study of music, right? The travel, the experience, the camaraderie that you get in sports, the experiences that come from social gathering. It's these types of things that really lead to happiness. And I gotta admit, like I thought about this often, this idea of just being able to do whatever you want as long as you want. And I feel as though it would get very tiring. If I had all the money in the world, if I had all the time in the world, and I think about what would my lifestyle be like, then I think to traveling all over the world. I think to riding jet skis or doing all this stuff. And that, like, those momentary pieces of happiness would eventually die out. And what I would be left with is having to do something that really made myself better, that was difficult to achieve, was something that didn't get old or tiring. And all of these things that I'm thinking are really higher pleasures, right? I would study more. I would read more books. I would learn to paint. I would, learn to play instruments. These things that are not just internal animalistic drives of me, but rather that kind of human, rationale, artistic types of endeavors. And he thought that when it comes to looking at these pleasures, right, that the person that can experience both the basic and higher pleasures are going to be the best set out to evaluate these two things versus someone who is just experiencing the basic pleasures, right? So if we were to think about that idea of ignorance is bliss, if we were to think about that idea of, well, what if I just didn't know any better? What if I just didn't care about the art, or I didn't care about the music? All I cared about was the partying. We wouldn't be inclined to really be in a position to gauge what is really beneficial or good or pleasurable from these circumstances, because we would be missing out on a part of them, right? I often draw the analogy really of having a child, right? A parent that has a child knows what it's like to not have a child and know what it's like to have a child. But to not have a child, you never know quite what it's like to have a child. And so the only person to gauge whether or not this action is going to be beneficial are those that experience that particular position. Otherwise, we're all kind of left in the dark here. And so from there, John Stuart Mill goes to talk about liberty. He talks about government, social order. And this is all going to kind of come back around. And he thought that when it comes to ruling a society, for instance, that nature really limits the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. Namely saying that, right, the government should not have the power to really legitimately kind of control an individual, except under certain circumstances. He thought that people should be free to the extent that they do not cause harm or prevent others from being free. And so this is where we get the harm principle. with John Stuart Mill, that if a person's actions directly harm another person or prevent a person from being free, that they can be rightfully punished by society. So this is where the old adage, right? My freedom ends where your nose begins. And that society should not impose its rules on me unless I am doing something that may harm somebody else or prevent someone else from being free. And so this is where we get that, right, classic libertarian position, right? The libertarian is the person that believes in liberty and that government should not step in unless you are harming another individual or preventing some other individual from gaining happiness. And note that this is a very direct cause and effect type of thing. With the world being interconnected the way it is, we might think, well, if it's my body, I can choose to commit suicide. I can choose to do certain types of drugs if I want. I can stay in my house and take all the heroin I want. And that's not hurting anybody but me. Now we might think to ourselves, well, yeah, but if you die, then it's going to hurt your mother, or it's going to hurt your father, or your loved ones. But this isn't really what John Stuart Mill is talking about. He's talking about the actual act of hurting somebody in terms of my direct action, not as a result of my action, somebody gets hurt in some way, right? Because your parents, your loved ones, their happiness is their own to keep. And so they need to try and be as happy as they can, just as you try to be as happy as you can. It more directs towards this idea of, for instance, well, if I start drinking and then go out driving, I can then very much hurt somebody or kill somebody and prevent them from being free. And so in this particular instance, the government can step in and say, no, 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 you are going to get a DUI, you're going to get put in jail for a little while because you are doing something that can directly hurt another individual. And so for Mill, each person is the proper guardian of his or her own health, bodily or mentally and spiritually. And so for the true libertarian, any action that affects only oneself is acceptable. Harming another person is unacceptable. And the government should be in the position to only act in certain instances where our behavior is harming another person or preventing another person from being free. So whenever there's definite damage or definite risk of damage, a person can be held responsible and punished. So if I physically go out and hurt somebody, if I'm drinking and driving, right, the risk, the definite risk is there. But contingent damage, that doesn't violate that does not violate one's duty or responsibility towards some other person. Right? Everyone is responsible for their own health and happiness. And just because someone is a member of my family and decides to hurt themselves or to do drugs or to do whatever, I need to deal with that in my own way. And so society is better off preserving freedom rather than punishing people based on contingent damage. So ultimately, where this comes into play is that for John Stuart Mill, society is going to be better off to ensure a sense of liberty. We take the small sacrifice of some people's convenience for the larger and greater gain of liberty. And again, think about this in terms of something like freedom of speech. In this country, we have a freedom of speech. We can basically say whatever we want because it's more important to be able to say whatever we want, even if it could be hurtful, even if it could be racist, even if it could be sexist, than if we were to curb this type of language in order for less liberty. Now, while government shouldn't necessarily step in and prevent us from having those liberties, Mill does talk about the idea of tyranny of the majority and how we can kind of group together to create these social pressures. And we see this happen all the time where government does not step in and punish people, but just the kind of tyranny of the majority does, right? This kind of through condemnation or ostracism. And so this is within the society's right, but at the same time, Mill warns against this idea as perhaps being even more damaging, right? So that if the government can't prevent people from doing something that harms others, society can step in. And as long as society doesn't threaten or harm an individual by means of something like, or doesn't threaten or harm an individual and just condemns or ostracizes the person, then this can be a way to kind of balance government's role in forcibly putting someone in jail and so forth. But again, this is something that Mill is incredibly skeptical of in terms of what we get, which is essentially just a kind of mob rule mentality, which can be incredibly problematic. And so he thought that freedom of opinion, expression, right, these things like freedom of speech are not harmful acts, but in fact beneficial, regardless of how terrible or bad they sound. They should not be punishable acts. So if I go out shouting racist or sexist slurs, right, not only is this not harmful, but it's actually quite beneficial for the society. And there's two reasons that people should be free to have these types of opinions or to be able to express themselves um, without being infringed on by the government. And it's through the suppression of truth and just individual cultivation. So when we think of the suppression of truth, right, we're naturally fallible human beings. So when we suppress opinions, it can be the case that we're in fact suppressing truth. So while we may think that something is wrong and that someone shouldn't be saying something or shouldn't be doing something, we are fallible and we may find out later in time that that act was correct or truthful or right and so forth. So think of during the times of the heretics in medieval period, in the kind of revolutionary period, where people like Copernicus or Galileo are expressing their beliefs about the world, philosophers are expressing their beliefs about the world, and their ideas are trying to be suppressed by the Catholic Church at the time. And so what may seem to be hateful or wrong in terms of what Galileo and Copernicus were saying turn out to be actually correct. And so trying to suppress them is suppressing the truth. Now, think of it in today's times, we may look back 100 years, 200 years at today and see how some individuals that said something that may be hateful now actually turned out to be correct, whatever it may be. And so it's difficult to prohibit these expressions of opinion because, right, society often gets it wrong. Just because everybody in society agrees with something, just because the majority of society agrees with someone, doesn't necessarily make that right. We actually have a fallacy about this known as the appeal to common practice or the appeal to tradition, in that we just kind of do what is tradition, we do what is commonly accepted, but this isn't necessarily right to do this. We can also think back again to this idea of Socrates, going back to ancient Greece and the Apology, and how Socrates corrupted the youth of Athens, right? Did he actually corrupt the youth of Athens? No, he didn't. However, right, by trying to suppress him and suppress the truth, society got it wrong. He was right. Society got it wrong. And so we need to be very careful, right? Because if we're saying that some people shouldn't say or do certain things, what happens if they are the ones that are doing it right? Then we run into all kinds of problems. In addition, right, this kind of takes away the idea of individual cultivation. So when similar ways of thinking and behaving lead to social stagnation, society becomes no longer able to progress, right? When we start to when everyone starts to believe the same things, that thing just becomes a dead dogma, right? It just becomes common understanding, but without the understanding. We know something is the case, but we don't know why it's the case. And if we don't know why it's the case, then perhaps it leads to bigger problems in the end, right? Or perhaps that leads to regress in terms of our cultivation individually, societally. And so it's important that we don't get too comfortable with the ideas that we have. Again, go back to Socrates in the Apology, go back to Socrates comparing himself to the gadfly. Excuse me. It's through his constant questioning of society, through his constant bothering, that makes for a better society and makes for better cultivated individuals. And so we should not be trying to prevent people from expressing ideas or opinions. And instead, we should be utilizing those as instances to understand situations better and to be more uh, knowledgeable about our position and what we think is right and so forth. And so when we think about liberty and we think about utilitarianism, Mill essentially argues that the greatest good is liberty. And so when it comes to those higher pleasures, nothing is higher, nothing is better than that freedom, that liberty to pursue one's own happiness. And you can kind of see here how John Stuart Mill's philosophies kind of tie into a lot of the philosophies of John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, and really those kind of ideologies that really promote what's become that kind of um, American ideology, this idea of freedom and liberty and pursuit of happiness. And so he thought that liberty will outweigh the benefits of restricting freedom for the greater good. So while we think we're often creating rules to protect certain individuals, it is really liberty that is going to make for the greatest of goods, the greatest of society. But again, this being said, we still wind up with these problems with utilitarianism, these ideas of greatest good for the greatest number. Even when we look at rule utilitarianism, for instance, it's not quite clear how we get certain particular rules within this concept of rule utilitarianism. If I think greatest good for the greatest number, but except in certain instances like killing someone or enslaving a people, right? We again reduce ourselves to a type of egoism or moral relativism, right? Who is to make these particular rules? Which one of these rules are going to stand for certain societies? I might think greatest good for the greatest number with exception to rules A, B, and C, but someone in another country, another society, another country might think greatest good for the greatest number except for rules D, E, and F. And so we kind of wind up back at this moral relativist position. And it's not going to be until we get to really understanding Kant, which is going to be the next lecture, where we have just one universal position that doesn't reduce to moral relativism or egoism. But of course, deontology, Kantianism is going to have its own set of problems to deal with.